Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture in the course. And here today we continue to examine key trends and developments in post-World War II America. Here today we turn our attention to a key trend in American politics in the late 20th century, the rise of the modern conservative movement. You will see in this lecture how this trend, this development in American politics, intersects with other trends we've seen in post-World War II America, the Cold War, the modern civil rights movements. Here today, though, we turn our attention to this other key element of America, its development in the second half of the 20th century, the rise of the modern conservative movement. So, buckle up, here we go. The best way to understand the modern conservative movement is as yet another social movement coming out of the 1950s and 1960s, though it is very different than the other social movements we have recently examined in this period: civil rights, feminism, gay rights. Conservatism is itself a social movement. It is a movement that has many similar characteristics as those other social movements we have recently examined. So the best way to understand the modern conservative movement is as a social movement in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, in the post-World War II period, with a vision of change for America. Now, that vision of change is very different than those who marched in the cause of civil rights, very different than the counterculture, feminism, some of the other social movements we examined, but the modern conservative movement is itself a social movement developing in that same period. The modern conservative movement is a grassroots movement. The modern conservative movement involves people marching in streets, voting, participating in politics as they try to steer America in a certain direction, albeit a very different direction than the other social movements we have described. So it certainly is in some ways a backlash to the social movements we've described: civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam movement. That's certainly one way of understanding the modern conservative movement. A group of Americans who are alarmed by the trends of civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, their perception of a more libertine society developing through the counterculture. But it would be wrong-headed to see the modern conservative movement solely as a backlash, because conservatives are also participating in a social movement and advocating for their vision of change. So we begin by introducing that concept, that the modern conservative movement is yet another social movement coming out of post-World War II America. It's in dialogue with the other social movements. It is in some ways a backlash, a reaction to those movements, but it is not purely reactionary. Conservatives have their vision of America. They have their vision of social change. They have their own answers to these questions at the heart of the argument without end. What is the nature of freedom? What defines this nation? Who is an American? And in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the modern conservative movement is in the streets advocating for their answers to those questions. Now, the modern conservative movement comes out of an anti-communist movement in the late 40s and early 1950s. That's the very beginning, the foundation. The Republican Party, after World War II, would rebrand itself as the party that would be most aggressive combating communism in the early Cold War period in the containment era, because, as we learned much earlier in the class, in the 1930s and 1940s, the Republican Party was the party of isolationism. It was a Democratic president, Franklin Roosevelt, who tried to nudge and urge the American people towards becoming involved in World War II, shaking off the slumber of isolationism. It was Roosevelt, a Democratic president, who criticized the America First movement and other isolationist movements in America in the late 30s and early 40s. Well, after Pearl Harbor, isolationism looked foolhardy. We were vulnerable. We were attacked on American soil, and that instigated the Republican Party to rebrand itself to jettison and successfully lose its image associated with isolationism and now rebrand itself as a much more active interventionist party in regards to foreign policy. The Republican Party would advocate for more military spending, more aggressive action against the Soviet Union, China, more military intervention. So the modern conservative movement comes out of an anti-communist movement. It comes out of an effort by the Republican Party to jettison its recent isolationist stance and embrace a much more interventionist, aggressive role around the world in combating what is seen to be the threat, the scourge of international communism. And then from that base, the modern conservative movement branches out and folds more Americans into the movement. From the anti-communist beginnings, it folds into its movement people who are alarmed by the more interventionist role the government has played in the economy since the New Deal. That, too, is something we have charted in recent lectures, how beginning with the Great Depression, the New Deal, continuing through World War II, the government would take a much more active role in the economy. That continued through the 1950s when the government continued spending programs like the Interstate Highway Act, which was designed to put Americans to work building highways, and that seemed very much like the New Deal. The Republican president of the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, embraced and continued that role of government intervening in the economy. He was fiscally conservative in regards to spending, but he recognized that the New Deal was here to stay. He embraced policies like Social Security and worked to undergird them. But that sparked a backlash. And this is the next element of the modern conservative movement. Along with the anti-communist beginnings, the conservatives who were advocating for a more aggressive conduct of the Cold War, the second element of the modern conservative movement, which we will trace in this lecture, the second leg of the three-legged stool of the modern conservative movement, fiscal conservatives. People who argued that the New Deal has gone too far, the government is too involved in the economy, and they tended to advocate for lower taxes, rolling back regulations on workplace safety or environmental regulations that begin in the 1960s, and overall, less government. So what began as an anti-communist movement folds into this movement people who we can describe as economic conservatives or fiscal conservatives, those who argue the New Deal's gone too far, the government's too involved in the economy, taxes are too high, we need lower taxes, less regulation, a smaller government footprint in the economy and society. And now comes the third leg of the stool, the third element of the modern conservative movement, alongside foreign policy conservatives who were much more hawkish and aggressive in regards to the Cold War, in addition to those fiscal or economic conservatives who wanted less government, lower taxes, less regulation, roll back some of the ways in which government has become more interventionist since the New Deal. The third leg in the stool, cultural conservatives. People who are alarmed by the rise of the modern feminist movement, alarmed by the greater assertiveness and activism of racial minorities in the civil rights era, alarmed by the more libertine sensibilities of the counterculture and the rise of the modern gay rights movement. That group, cultural, social conservatives, also joined this movement. So you have a coalition building by the 1960s. What began as an anti-communist movement, a rebranding of the Republican Party in the late 40s, early 50s, a party that was led by firebrands like Joseph McCarthy, now is a broader coalition that incorporated fiscal conservatives, those who wanted to roll back the more interventionist role that began with the New Deal, and cultural or social conservatives who are alarmed by the social trends of the 1960s. This congeals as the modern conservative movement. And they would take to the streets. They would launch grassroots campaigns, voter drives, many of the same methods employed by advocates for civil rights, advocates for the modern feminist movement. So to really appreciate the complexity and depth of America in this period to really understand the tumult and the social change that the 1960s represent. You have to now keep in mind that all of this is going on at the exact same time. You have the modern civil rights movement, the modern feminist movement, you have the modern gay rights movement, you have the countercultural movement, you have the anti-Vietnam movement, and at the same time, fueled by many of those other movements, you have this social movement, the modern conservative movement. Foreign policy conservatives. We need a more aggressive assault on international communism. Fiscal conservatives, lower taxes, less regulation. And social conservatives, those who are alarmed by, again, the ways in which America is changing in the 1960s. A key and revelatory moment in the history of the modern conservative movement occurs in 1964, when the Republican Party will nominate Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, as their candidate for the presidency. In 1964, Barry Goldwater would be the Republican Party's nominee for the White House, for the presidency. He would run as the Republican Party's nominee in 1964. And his nomination is a bellwether. It is very revelatory because with his nomination, it became clear that the Republican Party was now, as it to some extent remains to this day, more about that at the end of this lecture, an ideologically conservative party. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the Republican Party of the 1950s was led by Dwight David Eisenhower. He was the president for most of the 1950s, and he was a Republican. And he represented where the Republican Party still was in the 1950s when it was still a moderate party. As I mentioned, Eisenhower embraced elements of the New Deal, embraced the more interventionist role the government would play in the economy. Eisenhower supported at least the enforcement of civil rights. He was the president who called in the 101st Airborne to desegregate Little Rock High School. And so the Republican Party of the 1950s, led by Dwight David Eisenhower, was still a moderate party. Yes, it had firebrands within it like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy, but they were outliers. As I'll talk about in this slide, eventually they become the norm, the center of the Republican Party as it cleaves in a very conservative direction, but still in the 50s, it was the party of Eisenhower. But all that changes in the early 60s when the party is increasingly shifting in a more ideologically conservative era, when it is building that coalition I just described on the previous slide, when the three legs of the stool are coming together. And in the early 60s, the Republican Party is cleaving in that more conservative direction. There's this grassroots movement within the party that's rallying around its more conservative figures like Barry Goldwater. And it is that element of the party that controls the convention in 1964. It is that element of the party that is ultimately successful in nominating Barry Goldwater, who was, in many ways, the candidate that represented this more conservative orientation and strain of the party. That's really the significance of his nomination. It was no longer the party of Dwight Eisenhower, a moderate Republican. It was now a much more conservative party. Barry Goldwater's nickname was Mr. Conservative. So when he was nominated, it was very clear that the Republican Party was now cleaving in this direction. And Goldwater hit on every leg of the stool. He hit on every element of this new coalition, every register of the modern conservative movement. He advocated for a much more aggressive conduct of the Cold War, more military spending, more troops in Vietnam, more confrontation with the Soviet Union and China. So he really spoke to and resonated with the foreign policy wing of the modern conservative movement. Check. He is speaking to that group, that element of this coalition. He also spoke to and represented the concerns of the fiscal or economic conservatives that were now part of this coalition, because when he ran in 1964, he advocated ending the Social Security program. He wanted to end that. He said it's unconstitutional. The government shouldn't be involved in the economy and society in this way. And so he was asking to roll back the New Deal. So his candidacy represented where the Republican Party was by 1964, seeking to roll back the New Deal, and this resonated with Americans who would describe themselves as fiscal or economic conservatives. And Goldwater also appealed to that third element of the modern conservative movement, social or cultural conservatives, who are alarmed by the social movements of the 1960s, gay rights, feminism, and civil rights. And that's because Barry Goldwater, when he was a senator, voting in the Senate in 1964, voted against the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act, which we described in a recent lecture, the federal legislation that ends Jim Crow segregation on a federal level. Goldwater had voted against that. Now, Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act because he was a libertarian. He was one who was very opposed to government intervention in the economy and society. And as we learned in our lecture on civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to private businesses and private employers. It is the government telling those businesses they can no longer discriminate based on race. You can no longer have a sign up that says we don't serve African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. You can no longer refuse to hire racial minorities. So one of the key elements of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was how it intervened in the economy. As I stressed in our lectures on civil rights, you need the government to play that role, to force individuals, business owners in this case, to do what they're not inclined to do, treat people, customers, and potential employees equally. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was all about the government intervening in the economy, and that's why Goldwater voted against it. He did not vote against it because he was a Klansman. He did not vote against it because he was a white supremacist. He voted against it because he objected to that element of the Civil Rights Act. But if you are a Klansman, if you are a bigot, if you are someone who is opposed to civil rights in the 1960s, does it matter why Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964? No. In the 1964 presidential election, you had a very stark choice when it came to choosing who you would vote for the highest office in the land. The 1964 presidential election is a key barometer, a key measure in regards to civil rights and the sympathies of the American public. Because when you voted in 1964, you had two options, two choices. You could vote for Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic Party's nominee, who was running for his first full term as he became president in November of 1963 after Kennedy's assassination. Johnson was running as the incumbent, but really for his first term. He was the Democratic Party's nominee, and he had signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he was clearly on the side of civil rights. In fact, he was responsible for signing the Civil Rights Act into law and really responsible for getting it through Congress. The Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you do not get a more clear, stark choice. So Barry Goldwater is the nominee in 1964, and his nomination really tells you where the Republican Party was. It was no longer a moderate party. It was no longer the party of Dwight David Eisenhower. It was now a conservative party. The conservative wing of that party was now in charge. Goldwater's nomination was hammered through by grassroots movements, most of them located here in the Southwest. Goldwater was a senator from Arizona, and one key aspect I want to stress to you in this lecture of the modern conservative movement concerns its origins. Its origins were not in New York or Chicago or the Midwest. They weren't even in the American South, which today we so associate with the Republican Party and the modern conservative movement. Instead, the modern conservative movement was born here in Southern California, in the Southwest, in what's known as the Sun Belt states. In particular, it was born here in Southern California in Orange County, in the Inland Empire, in San Diego, where you had a large population of people who transplanted out to the Southwest after World War II, fleeing the more diverse, heterogeneous, pluralistic cities of the Midwest and East Coast. You get white flight, meaning whites fled Chicago and New York and Detroit, cities that were increasingly diverse as a result of changes in demography during World War II, another wave of the Great Migration. So a lot of white people came out to Southern California in the 50s and 60s, fleeing more diverse, heterogeneous urban spaces. They joined evangelical churches as they were looking for community in a new part of the country, in the suburbs of Southern California. And their membership in these evangelical churches urged them in a more conservative direction, opposing things like feminism, the sexual revolution, birth control. They often worked in the defense industry here in Southern California. They either were directly employed in the military in a part of the country, San Diego, Orange County, the Inland Empire, with large military bases, or they were somehow connected to the military, working at NASCO, working at Northrop Grumman, working for the big defense contractors. It's really hard to see this today because this is completely evaporated, but it's a very underappreciated element of modern American history, particularly here in Southern California. For a long time, there was this thriving defense industry. It's gone now. It's evaporated. And that tells you a lot about some of the trends in modern California history. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of people worked in the defense industry during the Cold War, when there was a massive military buildup, when there was a great expenditure on things like missiles and nuclear weapons and submarines and battleships. And because people's livelihoods were tied to the defense industry here in the Southwest, because they worked for NASCO and Northrop Grumman and the big defense contractors, well, they tended to be more conservative and supportive of a Republican Party that was always advocating for more military spending. So another element of Goldwater's nomination, not only does it demonstrate the ideological shift, it also demonstrates where the power base of the modern Republican Party was here in the Southwest. And it's no surprise, therefore, that a senator from Arizona got the nomination. The modern conservative movement was born here in California. Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, this history is very inaccessible to us because today we think of California as, hippy dippy California, blue state, right there on the left coast, where we all drive around in our Priuses and eat organic quinoa, right? That's the image of California today, but that's a very, 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 very recent development. Up until recently, we were a red state. Up until recently, California elected Republican governors. I know, one signed my diploma, Arnold. So this image of California today is hippy-dippy California, blue state, left coast, right? Very, 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 very recently. It has a lot to do with the decline of the defense industry in California. But the modern conservative movement was born here in California, in the Southwest. And that movement really took control of the Republican Party. And they had their nominee in 1964, Mr. Conservative. Goldwater gets the nomination. And his nomination is so indicative, so revelatory. But he loses in a landslide. He only carries a few states. To tack back to that dynamic I enunciated a moment ago, in 1964, you had a very clear choice. You could vote for the liberal Democrat Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act into law, or you could vote for, in many ways, his opposite, Barry Goldwater, conservative senator who voted against the Civil Rights Act. Well, in 1964, the American people came out and they voted in huge numbers for Lyndon Johnson. And as a result of that, you might think, well, the conservative movement had its moment, they got their guy, and they lost in a landslide, and it's over. But that misses the point. Just 4 years later, a conservative Republican from Orange County, Richard Nixon, will win the White House. And he will be reelected in 1972, 49 states to 1. Richard Nixon is reelected in 1972 in another landslide, this time in the other direction. Goldwater loses. He loses in a landslide. in part because he's represented as a crazy extremist who is going to start a nuclear war. There's a very famous TV ad that aired in 1964, in the 1964 presidential election. It only aired once, but it aired in primetime television just before the election was held. And in 1964, there were only 4 channels on your TV. Imagine such an age. I know. How oppressive. How did people live in such an age where they only had 4 channels? But because of that, if you aired an ad on primetime TV in an age where there are only 4 channels, tens and tens of millions of people are going to see it. It's called the Daisy ad. And it's called the Daisy ad because it featured a beautiful, cute little blonde girl traipsing through a meadow of daisies. It's a beautiful, idyllic scene. This cute little girl, she's traipsing through this meadow of daisies. The daisies are blowing in the wind. And she stops and she picks one of the daisies. And then she begins to do what kids do, pluck the petals of this daisy that she has picked. And while this is going on, while there's this beautiful scene of this cute little girl picking daisies, in the background, there's a mushroom cloud. And all it says is, vote Johnson in 64. That's it. One of the most famous political ads in American history that only aired once. But as simple as it is, as solitary as it is, it was damn effective because the implication was clear. If you elect Barry Goldwater president, that crazy fucker is going to start a nuclear war and they're going to drop a bomb on your beautiful blonde daughter. The whole idea of the ad was, if you elect Goldwater, the guy's crazy, he's an extremist, and he's going to start a nuclear war. And we can't have that. So Goldwater loses in a landslide, in part because he was represented as an extremist. He didn't do himself any favor because he called himself an extremist. He said, I'm an extremist in the defense of liberty. Well, who doesn't want to be an extremist in the defense of liberty? As we've learned in this class, American culture really centers on this valuation of freedom, even though freedom is under debate and contest. Goldwater said, I'm an extremist when it comes to freedom. But when you call yourself an extremist in a way that's designed to be positive in your defense of liberty, it kind of makes you susceptible to things like the Daisy ad that will represent you as an extremist in a way that's very scary. So Goldwater loses. He loses in a landslide. But just 4 years later, conservative Republican Richard Nixon will be elected president. And he will be reelected in 1972, 49 states to 1. What happens in that period? Well, civil rights, a more assertive, aggressive social presence for racial minorities, demanding equality and opportunity. Feminism, gay rights, the anti-Vietnam movement. Johnson wins in a landslide in 64, but by 68, so many elements of the American population seeing the greater assertiveness of racial minorities, seeing the rise of a modern feminist movement where women are challenging gender roles and demanding equality, seeing the more libertine expressions of the counterculture and the rise of the anti-Vietnam movement, those Americans will cleave in a very conservative direction. So Goldwater represents the way in which the modern Republican Party becomes more conservative. He loses in a landslide, but just 4 years later, they win the White House. And that conservative Republican who will win in 68 is reelected, 49 states to 1. Goldwater's nomination not only indicates that the Republican Party is becoming more conservative, their later victories represent them as this growing force that will dominate American politics in the late 20th century. Here is that quote I referenced a moment ago that demonstrates how Goldwater, in a very cerebral way, admitted to being an extremist. This is a quote that later, as you can see, will be festooned onto one of his campaign buttons from his acceptance speech at the 1964 Republican Convention, where he accepted the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency. He was introduced, interestingly, at that convention by Ronald Reagan, who we'll talk a lot more about in just a moment. Goldwater accepts the nomination, and he says in his speech, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice," meaning I am an extremist defending liberty. Who doesn't want to defend liberty, right? "Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I will not be moderate when it comes to justice." So, a couple things here. One, look how politicians spoke not that long ago, 1964. They used words with more than 2 syllables, right? They treated the American public with at least some respect and some acknowledgement that we are thoughtful, engaged people. Not that long ago, in 1964, a politician used this language. Can you imagine any American politician from any party speaking in this way today, using such words? No, it's impossible to imagine. It's the dumbing down of America. But of course, the other thing to note about this quote is that Goldwater admitted to being an extremist in the defense of liberty, but it made him very vulnerable to a caricature like that in the Daisy ad, that he was a great extremist who would bring about a nuclear war. And that played a role in his defeat in 64. But again, his defeat in 64 is not the point. The modern conservative movement may have lost in 64 when they nominated Goldwater, but they make major gains in the decades ahead. And they make major gains in part because they win over white voters in the South in what the Republican Party itself described as its Southern strategy. So let's now tack back to something I've been noting in these slides here. Goldwater loses in 64, but just 4 years later, Nixon wins in 68 and then is reelected in 72 in a landslide. Ronald Reagan will be elected in 1980, and the modern conservative movement will come to dominate American politics in the late 20th century. How do they do that, even after Goldwater's defeat? Well, part of it is the Southern strategy, where the Republican Party directly targets white voters in the South and wins them over to their party. For a long time, since the end of the Civil War in 1865, the South, the states of the old Confederacy, was known as the Solid South in its solid support for the Democratic Party. Hard to imagine today, because when we think of these states today, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, we think of red state America. We think of solid in their support for the Republican Party. But for 100 years, from the 1860s to the 1960s, that part of the country was solid in its support for the Democratic Party. Why? Well, the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, and so this part of the country hated the Republican Party. And they supported the Democratic Party after the Civil War and for decades to come. But in the 1960s, 100 years after the Civil War, the Democratic Party was increasingly becoming the party of civil rights. It will be a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who will sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It will be a Democratic president who will sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, allowing racial minorities to vote for the first time in this country since Reconstruction. It will be a Democratic president who will sign into law the Hart-Celler Act, which will open America's borders to immigrants from Africa, Asia, Latin America in 1965. So the Democratic Party in the 1960s was becoming the party of civil rights. It was becoming the party advocating for equality, a more generous, heterogeneous vision of America. This began as far back as the New Deal, when for the first time African Americans were changing their political loyalty towards the Democratic Party, partly due to the very, very modest reform efforts the New Deal offered to racial minorities. So it's a slow process, but by the 1960s, the Democratic Party is becoming a party that is much more open to civil rights and winning the votes of African Americans. And then you get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Hart-Celler Act, all this landmark legislation that comes from a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson. So by the 1960s, the Democratic Party is the party of civil rights in ways that we have documented in previous lectures and recapitulate here. And that means that white voters in the South can't support the Democratic Party anymore. They're not going to vote for the Democrats because the Democrats are the ones responsible for these legal shifts like Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act. And here comes the Republican Party, which will consciously appeal to disaffected whites in the South who cannot support the Democratic Party, who will try to win over lifelong Democrats. We're talking about white Southerners whose parents and grandparents all supported the Democratic Party when it was the Solid South, who can no longer support the Democratic Party because it's the party of civil rights. This is the Southern strategy, where the Republican Party directly appeals to whites who are upset about civil rights, the more interventionist role the government is playing in the cause of civil rights, and the Republicans successfully bring them over to their side. And that's how those states become red states. That's how the electoral map shifts. So that today when we think of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, we think of red state America, even though for 100 years it was the Solid South and its support for the Democratic Party. By the 1970s, as part of this Southern strategy, it no longer becomes acceptable, at least then, to be an outward racist in American politics. The last politician, at least in the 20th century, there are some politicians who have come along more recently, but in the 70s, the last politician who really got away with being an avowed and open racist in public was George Wallace, who was the Democratic governor of Alabama, who tried to prevent desegregation in that state. If you ever have to endure that Lynyrd Skynyrd song, Sweet Home Alabama, and I hope you don't, but it appears in a lot of strange places like Despicable Me, it's on the soundtrack, right? When Lynyrd Skynyrd say they support the governor in that song, they're talking about George Wallace, who was an open bigot who supported segregation. So the next time you hear that song, turn the goddamn thing off, right? Because they're saluting a bigot. They're saluting an open, avowed racist. But Wallace was sort of the last guy to do that. By the 1970s, it became increasingly unacceptable to be an outward, expressive, blatant, explicit racist in American politics. And with it comes a shift in language as part of the Southern strategy, where conservative Republicans would use language that appealed to race and racism and racial bonds of affinity without being explicitly and openly racist. For example, Nixon, when he runs in 68, says, I'm going to be the candidate of law and order. Where have we heard that more recently? Yeah. Hopefully you're starting to make some connections here. Nixon runs in 68 saying, I'm going to be the president of law and order. And that appeals to a lot of Americans who are anxious and harried and overwhelmed by social protests and blood in the streets and the very violent clashes of the late 60s. I'm going to put more cops on the streets. I'm going to have longer prison sentences, Nixon argues. I'm going to be the candidate of law and order. Now, on the surface, that has nothing to do with race, right? I haven't said anything about race, white, black. But the implication was clear. When Nixon talked about law and order, he was arguing that racial minorities are responsible for lawlessness and disorder. They're the ones in the streets, in the uprisings, in the long hot summer of 1967, the social protests of that moment. So though law and order on its surface has nothing to do with race, it is freighted and loaded with race. And so Nixon says more cops, longer prison sentences. He launches a war on drugs as he becomes president in the late 60s, early 70s, which, by the way, has worked out really great, right? Hasn't that war on drugs gone great? Nobody does drugs in America anymore, right? Yeah. But in the war on drugs, racial minorities are the ones targeted. They're the ones who became the target of that effort. They're the ones who became incarcerated. And that began the phase of mass incarceration, what some scholars refer to as the new Jim Crow that replaced the old Jim Crow in the 1960s. So law and order is a good indication of the Southern strategy where you don't explicitly talk about race, but still talk about race in a way that builds a coalition based on race, appealing to white voters in the South who associate lawlessness and disorder with racial minorities. The Republicans would talk about states' rights and freedom of association. Now, states' rights was the rhetoric of the Confederacy. It was part of their arguments about secession in the Civil War, that they should not have to accept the dictates of Abraham Lincoln as he sought to stop the extension of slavery. So the very language comes out of the defense of slavery, Civil War, and the Confederacy. But here it's being used against civil rights, arguing the federal government should not say that we have to open our schools to all learners or that you have to open your business to racial minorities. Remember, I can't stress this enough. I've stressed it throughout the class. The cause of civil rights only goes forward in American history through big government. It's when the federal government tells individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. That was one of the lessons we stress in our lectures on civil rights. It is the federal government who says you have to allow blacks to vote. You have to serve African Americans. You can't bar the doors of your school or university. It's not because in the 60s, every white person said, let's live side by side, kumbaya. It's not about changing attitudes. It's not about changing hearts and minds. It's about forcing people to do what they're not inclined to do. Well, in response to that, Republicans talk about states' rights. Federal government shouldn't be intervening here in Tennessee and Louisiana. We should be free from that government intervention. Freedom of association. You should just decide who you have to rent your apartment to. Government shouldn't come in and tell you you have to rent it to anyone that qualifies. Again, states' rights, freedom of association, on the surface, has nothing to do with race. But in reality, it was part of the Southern strategy where the Republican Party could talk about things like states' rights and appeal in a way that was about race, in a way of building a now coalition with white voters in the South who turned against a Democratic Party that was now the party of civil rights. The Republicans would talk about the evils of welfare, arguing that welfare is bad for society, it discourages work, arguing that racial minorities are living large, cashing welfare checks while you, the white working class, pick up the bill. Now, Republicans say, well, that's just part of our argument against big government. It's part of our argument against government spending, the evils of welfare, how welfare is bad for you. But in reality, it was, again, a way of talking about race without talking about race, appealing to racist stereotypes that racial minorities were the ones living large on welfare while the white working class was picking up the bill. That is obscene and vulgar in two key ways. One, it's just wholly inaccurate. The majority of people who received welfare in the 60s and 70s, like the majority of people who receive assistance today in the 21st century, are white. Though there has been a deliberate effort by conservatives for 50 years now to associate welfare with racial minorities, or today, illegal immigrants, the majority of people who receive government assistance today are white. And that is just a stubborn fact, which means associating welfare with racial minorities is vulgar and ugly. But the other way in which it is vulgar and ugly is it is so ahistorical. As we learned in this class, go back to the origins of what is colloquially described as welfare, aid for families with dependent children. That began as a New Deal program in the 30s, and when it began, it forbid racial minorities from receiving benefits. For most of American history, the only people who received government assistance were whites. Whether it was aid for families with dependent children, Social Security in its early incarnation, public housing programs, when all those New Deal programs were established and continued through the 40s and 50s and early 60s, they forbid racial minorities from receiving benefits. So this idea that it's racial minorities who are living large on welfare, obscene. There was a country music song in the early 70s called Welfare Cadillac, which made it very clear, this idea that racial minorities in cities are driving Cadillacs while you, the white working class, pick up the bill. It's vulgar, it's obscene, it's inaccurate, but it became an important arrow in the quiver of the Republican Party, which allowed them to win over white voters who became convinced that, yeah, it's racial minorities who are enjoying welfare. Republicans could always say, no, it's part of our argument for less government spending. But It was clearly designed as part of the Southern strategy to appeal to white voters and fold them into this growing coalition that is developing in the years after Goldwater's defeat. And you could see the success of this by the late 60s. Goldwater loses in a landslide. But by 1968, Richard Nixon, conservative Republican from Orange County, is elected president. Re-elected in 1972 in a landslide. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, who wasn't a Californian by birth but claimed California as his home state, is elected governor of California, 1966, and by 1980, president of the United States. So again, if you just focus on the 1964 election, you might be tempted to say America had its moment and it ratified civil rights. It said, we want Lyndon Johnson. He's the president who signed the Civil Rights Act into law. He would be the president who would later sign into law the Voting Rights Act, the Hart-Celler Act. But again, that's short-sighted because just 4 years after Johnson's election in 1964, Richard Nixon wins the White House. In 66, Reagan wins the governorship of California. He's very indicative of where California was in the late 20th century. A red state, a conservative state, a state that gave you the modern conservative movement. And by 1980, Ronald Reagan is president. Ronald Reagan's hero was Barry Goldwater. Ronald Reagan, when he wins the White House in 1980, is Barry Goldwater all over again, except he wins. So by the late 60s, the conservative movement is ascendant, and it is the dominant political force. It will remain the dominant political force through the end of the 20th century. How does this happen? Well, between 64 and 68, you have a burgeoning civil rights movement where racial minorities are increasingly more assertive. There's greater emphasis on racial pride and greater calls for more government action to ameliorate poverty, more government spending. So racial minorities are more assertive, more visible, and they're calling for a continuation of a civil rights revolution that was beginning to stall. By the late 60s, there's a growing and visible feminist movement where women are challenging gender roles, challenging a beauty industry that argues women's only worth is in their physical appearance. Women are increasingly demanding access to education and employment. By the late 60s, the anti-Vietnam movement is at its apex as young people are refusing to serve, marching in the streets, demanding an end to that ruinous war. By the late 60s, the culture is shifting. A more libertine sensibility is developing. The sexual revolution is at its apex, where people are experimenting with sex and birth control is increasingly available. And many Americans watching all these developments cleave in a very conservative direction. So by the late 60s, the conservative movement is gaining and becoming dominant and ascendant despite the defeat of Goldwater in 64. In 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected president. We referenced him in our lecture on the Cold War and how he presides over the final stage of détente and what is recognized as the final stage of the Cold War. Let's now talk about Reagan in regards to our focus here, politics and the modern conservative movement. Reagan ran in 1980 against an incumbent president, James Carter. And that is a very, very difficult task to defeat an incumbent president. It doesn't happen too often. You need a major economic collapse like we had in 1932 with the Great Depression, or a third-party candidate, which we had in 1980 when John Anderson also ran, or you need a calamitous response to a major pandemic, evidently, to be defeated as an incumbent president. So Reagan was running against an incumbent, Jimmy Carter. And he ran as, again, a conservative. He ran clearly as the continuation of Goldwater. Goldwater was his hero. He had introduced Goldwater at the 64 convention. And Reagan ran appealing to what was now congealed as the modern conservative movement. foreign policy conservatives. He talked tough, called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and wanted to go back to massive military spending. So Cold War, hawkish, foreign policy conservatives love Reagan. He appealed to fiscal conservatives. He said, we're going to lower taxes, we're going to roll back regulation. In the 1970s, the American economy was in so many ways running on empty as deindustrialization ravaged the American economy, as factories closed and moved overseas. A major energy crisis rocked America as gas prices quadrupled, or there were massive gas shortages where you had to wait in line for hours just to buy a few gallons of gas. The American Union movement, working class movement, was in decline. We faced high inflation and a stagnant economy. And Reagan said, I know what to do. Let's lower taxes, roll back regulation, make America able to compete, and that will restore prosperity. And he appealed to cultural conservatives as he kicked off his campaign for the presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This was on the previous slide, but I failed to mention it, but it's relevant here. He kicked off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a major American city at the heart of the American Revolution. He kicked off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a small, tiny town, few voters. Why would he kick off his campaign there? Well, Philadelphia, Mississippi was the site of the slaying of 3 civil rights workers that would later lead to the Voting Rights Act. It was the city associated with white supremacy and violence against civil rights. It was the city that would be later acknowledged in the book and movie Mississippi Burning that documents the killing of those civil rights workers who were there in Mississippi simply trying to register blacks to vote. Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1980 was a city associated with racialized violence. It was a landmark representation of white backlash to black voting rights. In that city, Klansmen killed 3 civil rights workers, one of them African American. And Ronald Reagan went out of his way to go to that little town and give a speech there, an open nod that he was with the white voters of Mississippi, a way in which, again, the Southern strategy activated. So Reagan was the continuation of Goldwater. He was, in many ways, demonstrative of the growing power of the modern conservative movement, and he appealed to all 3 elements of this coalition we've described, all 3 legs of the stool. But he had a really charismatic, telegenic appeal as well that plays a role in his success in 1980. He was a former actor and television star, so he's good on TV. And in those appearances on television, he appealed to nostalgia. He talked about his boyhood home. He talked about simpler times. And Americans in the 1970s craved nostalgia. The 1970s, we tend to think of it as the disco era. But the 1970s was a very traumatic time in America. The economy was terrible. As I described, America was facing the end of American boom times, the post-war expansion. By the 1970s, that post-war expansion came to an end. Factories were closing, deindustrialization, the end of the industrial economy. Unions were in decline. Gas prices were high. People were buying Toyotas and Datsuns and turning their back on the big tuna boat sedans cranked out from Detroit by Ford and GM, laying off auto workers. We lost in Vietnam. America experienced its first major military defeat. Watergate, scandals. So the 1970s is a very traumatic time, and Americans hungered for simpler times, better times. When Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, one of his slogans was, "Make America Great Again." Yeah, Reagan came up with that. Like everything else, Trump stole that, right? Trump's never come up with an original thought. He stole that from Reagan. That was Reagan's campaign. It's very indicative of Reagan's emphasis on nostalgia. Let's make America great again. And that appealed to Americans in the 70s who saw the economy in decline, witnessed the defeat in Vietnam. By the late 70s, you have the revolution in Iran, where young people rebelling against American involvement in Iran seize the embassy in Tehran and take American State Department workers hostage. Another example of America weak and vulnerable around the world. And so, in the 70s, people hungered to make America great again. That's why in the 70s, nostalgia was such a part of our culture. One of the most popular TV shows in the 1970s, Happy Days. The very name, right? Can't we go back to those happy days? It was a TV show set in the 50s in Milwaukee. And it represented this image of America, the 1950s, that appealed to Americans harried and overwhelmed in the 70s. Happy days. Can't we go back to those happy days before civil rights, feminism, gay rights? Another popular TV show in the 1970s was The Waltons, and though it was set in a time of economic deprivation, the Great Depression, it was about a close-knit family, a rural family who held together through the Great Depression. In the 1970s, you had families fracturing. You had a steep rise in the divorce rate, the highest divorce rate in American history. You know, today you still hear this false, erroneous statistic, half of all marriages end in divorce. It's just not true. In fact, divorce has been in decline since 1980, but in the 70s, it was at its height. And so this image of the Waltons, a close-knit family that stuck together through hard times, very popular show in the 1970s. Grease was a popular movie of the 1970s, also set in the 50s. So Reagan tapped into that hunger for nostalgia. He tapped into that hunger for simpler times before the tumult of the 60s, social movement, civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, and the way in which America was battered and beleaguered by a terrible economy, defeats around the globe, Watergate scandal in the 1970s. So this is a successful formula that will allow Reagan to win in 1980, even though Goldwater was defeated just 16 years prior when he ran as Mr. Conservative. Reagan appeals to the elements of the American coalition. He employs the Southern strategy. He campaigns with Jerry Falwell, the televangelist, who urged his followers to vote for Ronald Reagan as some sort of paragon of morality. Don't worry, he used to be divorced, right? Yeah. He used the rhetoric of the Southern strategy, the rhetoric of the modern conservative coalition, talking about family values in a way, in an era that so sought out those images of happy days and Waltons, and in America that was transformed by feminism and the sexual revolution. Reagan talked about welfare cheats and employed that argument about the evils of welfare that was very freighted and coded language in regards to race. He talked about more cops, law and order, and doubled down on that idea of a war on drugs and long prison sentences. And all this helps explain what was called the Reagan Revolution, how Reagan won in 1980. So Goldwater loses in 64, Nixon wins in 68, reelected in 72, and even with the Watergate scandal that will briefly return the Democratic Party to the White House, Reagan wins in a landslide, defeating Carter in 1980. Reagan promised to make America great again, and he said, I have a formula for that. Reaganomics. Reaganomics refers to Reagan's domestic policy. He inherited a ton, and though he talked tough in regards to the Soviet Union, he continued to taunt and help to continue that approach to the Soviet Union. That was his foreign policy. In regards to his domestic policy, Reaganomics. And Reaganomics was the application of what Goldwater and others had advocated since the 1960s. Less government, lower taxes, regulation. Reaganomics has three elements to it. Lower taxes, particularly on the wealthiest Americans. When Reagan came in as president, the top marginal tax rate was 70%, if you can imagine that today. Today it's in the high 30s, meaning that after a certain level of income, every dollar you earn after that will be taxed at 70%. For most of the golden age of the American middle class, the post-war economic boom we've talked about in recent lectures in the 50s, 60s, we had high tax rates. 1950s, 1960s, what's often celebrated as the golden age of the American middle class. We had high tax rates, we had high union membership, and we had lots of government spending. And guess what? It was a great time to buy a house, to send your kids to college. Reagan, though, argues, no, tax rates are too high. We need to cut taxes, particularly for the wealthy. And he would lower them as low as 28%. His argument was if rich people have more money, they'll invest it, and the economy will revitalize and grow. So one element of Reaganomics, lower tax rates, particularly for the wealthiest Americans, rolling back the high tax rates that had prevailed in the 50s and 60s during that time of post-war economic expansion. Next element of Reaganomics was rolling back what Reagan argued were onerous regulations, environmental regulations that had been created in the 60s during the modern environmentalist movement, leading to things like the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act. Reagan argued those environmental regulations have gone too far. We need to roll them back. America's competing with Germany, Japan, China. We need to get lean and mean if we want to revitalize the American dream and the American economy. He argued for rolling back regulations of workplace safety. And then the third element of Reaganomics was anti-union, deunionization politics, which is ironic because Ronald Reagan was once the head of a union. In the 1930s, Ronald Reagan was the head of SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, the union that represents people in Hollywood. He was then a New Deal Democrat who supported Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal policies, many of which we learned were pro-union. But after World War II, like many Americans, Reagan took a conservative turn, and now all of a sudden he argued unions are the problem, even though he was once the head of a union. He argued unions are too big, too bloated, too detached from the interest of their members, and he would preside over a massive decline in union memberships. There's a very telling and important incident early in the first few months of Reagan's presidency. He wins in 80, defeating Carter. He's sworn in 81. And soon after he's sworn in, PATCO goes on strike. PATCO was a union representing air traffic controllers. That's what the ATC stands for in PATCO. So not PETCO, that's where the pets go. PATCO was a labor union representing air traffic controllers. They went on strike in 1981, going on strike in the cause of greater job security. Reagan declared the strike illegal, a threat to national security. It was the Cold War. We need air traffic controllers to protect our airspace from a potential Soviet invasion. And as a result of declaring the strike illegal, he summarily fired every air traffic controller that went on strike. They never worked as air traffic controllers again. He crushed this union. It doesn't exist today. And this occurred very early in his presidency. And that was an indication to corporate America that they had an ally in the White House if they too got tough, cracked down on their unions. So this is a very telling moment early in Reagan's presidency that set the tone for his presidency. He crushed this union, and that was an open nod to GM, to Ford, to General Electric, to major corporations in America that if they wanted to get tough on their unions, they had an ally in the White House. So the third element of Reaganomics, deunionization. And over the course of his presidency, there'd be a huge decline in union membership. Again, during the 50s and 60s, the heyday of the American middle class, high union membership. More than 50% of the private sector, American workforce, was a member of a union. Today, unions are basically non-existent in the private sector. You could see the struggles of Amazon workers to unionize. It's difficult. And the only unions that really exist anymore are public sector unions, and they have been under a huge assault in the last decade, 2 decades. It's very telling in America, very revealing in America today that the most prominent and powerful union represents millionaires. What's the most powerful union in America today? It's not the teacher union, no, it's the baseball players union, right? They got clout, but they represent millionaires. Where the unions that represent middle class people, they largely evaporated thanks to the deliberate policy of Ronald Reagan, himself a former union head, as part of Reaganomics. How you thought about Reaganomics was revealed in how you described it. People who supported Reaganomics refer to it as supply-side economics. The idea here was, for too long, since the New Deal, we focus on the demand side of the economy, trying to put people to work, put money in people's pockets. If you remember the New Deal, it was the WPA, it was the CCC, it was Social Security, which I described as a consumer program. Put money in the pockets of people, they'll spend it, the economy will grow. That's a demand-side approach. Reagan said, no, it's gone too far. We need to focus on the supply side, the manufacturers, the industrialists. We need to gear our economic policy in a way that's good for them because they're competing with Germany, Japan, China. And so roll back regulations, lower taxes. If you supported Reaganomics, you called it supply-side economics. If you opposed it, you called it trickle-down economics, which was a pejorative, a criticism. Trickle-down economics is the idea that all the benefits go to the people at the top, and a few scraps trickle down to the middle and working class elements of American society. Certain elements of the American economy thrived by the mid-'80s, particularly the deregulated elements of the economy that came with Reaganomics, deregulation, banking, finance, real estate. As a result, you had mega mergers where corporations could buy up competitors, and you have these huge conglomerates that under one corporate umbrella produced dog food, motorcycles, and diapers, right? Some big, massive corporation that became so massive thanks to deregulation allowed corporations to buy up their competitors, to consolidate. And this was a huge boon to the stock market, to the deregulated elements of the economy, banking, finance, real estate. And as a result came a new image of success in the 1980s and a new word to reflect it, yuppie. What's a yuppie? Well, it comes from the first three letters of this word, YUP, which stood for Young Urban Professional. This was the new elite, the new glamour class, the new marker of success in the Reagan era. Young urban professionals, young people living in cities who work in banking, finance, and real estate. They drive around in BMWs. They wear Pierre Cardin. And they walk around wheeling and dealing, speaking into this remarkable device that appeared in the 1980s. Was about the size of a brick called a cellular phone. Yeah, in the 80s, they appeared and became symbols of affluence. The yuppie was the new success story in America. But it was a very particular success that was only for young college-educated professionals. They were thriving, wheeling and dealing in real estate, banking, and finance. But who was left behind? Working class people who saw factories close as deindustrialization continued in the 1980s despite Reagan's promise to make America great again. And people who found themselves now working in service sector jobs. Since the 1970s, the American economy has shifted, where factories close. Today, so much manufacturing takes place outside the United States. Those industrial jobs we've talked so much about in this class, they evaporate by the 70s and 80s. The clothes you're wearing right now, the car you'll drive later today, the food you'll eat for dinner, probably made outside this nation. We don't make things in America anymore. So we have seen a shift in the economy with a decline in manufacturing. And the jobs that replaced those factory union jobs were service sector jobs. Now, service sector jobs have two tiers. There are the high-end service sector jobs in banking, finance, real estate, accounting, law, medicine. If you're a doctor, you don't make anything. You don't make a widget in a factory. If you're an accountant, you don't make a durable good. You provide a service. But because that service requires a college degree, you get a good middle-class salary. The other side, the other tier of the service sector economy, retail, fast food, hospitality, home health care, low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs. That's the America that has emerged since the 1980s with the rise of a service sector economy and the decline of industrial jobs, which has hollowed out the middle class, made it harder and harder to buy a home, send your kids to college. So the yuppie became the symbol of success, but it was a very exclusive success. It was only for young urban professionals, college graduates working in certain segments of the economy. You could see that yuppie ideal expressed in the pop culture of the 1980s. Primetime soaps like Dynasty and Dallas that celebrated the super rich. You had the beginnings of reality TV in the 1980s, with shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, hosted by Robin Leach, where every week in the syndicated TV program, Robin Leach brought you into the manor homes, vacation homes, penthouses of the super rich. The pop culture we have today, where people spend their leisure time watching other people be rich as some sort of perverse form of entertainment. The pop culture of today of Kardashians and Real Housewives, that began here in the 1980s. Shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, where we were spending our idle time watching other people be rich. You had shows like Star Search 1980s, the precursor to American Idol, where someone is plucked out of obscurity for fame and fortune. So this yuppie ideal, the celebration of the super rich, was represented in a pop culture that in many ways prevails to this day. What about the decline of working class America? Well, you could see it in another popular TV show of the 1980s, Roseanne. Now I know Roseanne has been canceled, right? We can't talk about so many of the pop culture figures of the 80s have done something terrible or ignominious that has made them personas non grata, right? Think about Roseanne, Michael Jackson, Hulk Hogan, right? Any big pop culture figure of the 1980s has, done something terrible in recent years. Roseanne, of course, tweeted out all kinds of racist images. But before that iteration of Roseanne, in 1980, she had a very successful sitcom, which was about a suburban family in suburban Illinois where the mom loses her good-paying union job and for the rest of the series goes from one shitty service sector job to another. It was in many ways a documentary of the harried, overwhelmed American middle class. So from Reaganomics came this divide, this two-tier America. Yeah, there were yuppies wheeling and dealing on Wall Street. Yeah, there were mega mergers that made capital groups like Bain Capital billionaires. But the other side of the American economy, captured in shows like Roseanne, was this American middle class, working class that now find themselves on the underside of the American dream. In 1992, Bill Clinton won the White House. And for many, that was a sign that the conservative movement may now be in decline. Because since Ronald Reagan, certainly, but even going back to Nixon, the Republican Party had come to dominate the presidency. Nixon wins in 68, reelected in 72, and Watergate would briefly dethrone the Republican Party, but Reagan wins in 80. He's reelected in a huge landslide 84. His vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, wins in 88. It seemed going into the 90s, the Republican Party, this modern conservative movement, now had a monopoly on the White House. But in 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush lost, partly due to a recession in the early 90s, but also a third-party candidate, which often plays a role in defeating an incumbent. H. Ross Perot ran in 1992 and probably drew some votes away from George Herbert Walker Bush, and that opened the door to a former Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton winning the White House. And so when Clinton won in 1992, Democrats had won the White House for the first time since 76, and it looked like perhaps this great ascendance of the Republican Party and the modern conservative movement was coming to an end. But the problem with that idea is that Clinton, as much as he is still falsely represented, caricatured as some sort of wild-eyed hippie in the White House, liberal, governed as a conservative, Clinton inherited the Reagan Revolution and continued it. As president, he would continue to lower taxes, continue to deregulate, including deregulation of the housing and finance industry that would lead later to the recession that began in 2008. With wild speculation in the housing industry fueled by the deregulation that Clinton presided over. He signed into law NAFTA, which accelerated the decline of manufacturing in America as many companies relocated to Mexico and operated maquiladoras where they could pay workers in Mexico a fraction of what were union wages paid to American workers in the United States. He signed into law what was known as the Welfare to Work Bill, which conceded to and embraced conservative rhetoric about welfare, that somehow it was this pernicious force that was encouraging people not to work, that this would somehow create a culture of work and encourage people to go to work and build wealth. Well, the problem with that is the percentage of children living in poverty has increased since the Welfare to Work Bill. When people were purged off the welfare rolls with Clinton's, oh, there's a Freudian slip, Clinton's Welfare to Work Bill in 1996, they found themselves working those low pay, low prestige jobs in fast food retail. And so, yeah, they weren't receiving welfare anymore, but they certainly weren't vaulting out of poverty. And that's why the percentage of children living in poverty has actually increased. But the Welfare to Work Bill was signed into law by Bill Clinton, who was conceding to and embracing conservative arguments about the evils of welfare. Bill Clinton would sign into law DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which was an effort to prevent states from recognizing same-sex marriage. So we have this image of Bill Clinton today that's continually perpetuated by Fox News and Sean Hannity, that he was some sort of wild-eyed socialist, right? Bullshit. Again, history is the remedy for bullshit. All you have to do is look at the historical record, and it's very clear that Clinton, who called himself a new Democrat, said, I'm not like those old Democrats like Franklin Roosevelt, his New Deal, Lyndon Johnson with civil rights and the Great Society program that created things like Medicaid and Medicare. He said, I'm not like those old Democrats who used lots of government intervention in the economy and government spending. I'm a new Democrat. Clinton famously said, the era of big government is over. So, though conservatives still like to represent Clinton as some sort of wild-eyed liberal, he governed like a conservative. He signed into law a crime bill that continued mass incarceration and emphasis on a more punitive approach to social problems. He signed into law DOMA that, again, was an explicit effort to prevent recognition of same-sex marriage. Proof of this is, of course, when his wife, Hillary Clinton, runs for president in 2016, all this came back to haunt her. When supporters of Bernie Sanders said, why did your husband and you support all these measures like welfare to work, like NAFTA, like DOMA, that were very indicative of conservative politics? Well, Hillary really stumbled in answering those questions, and it opened the door to a serious challenge from Sanders. The net effect of this was to continue what began with Reaganomics, this increasing divide between haves and have-nots. Early in the class, we had a lecture on the Gilded Age, and we talked about that period in America in the late 20th century where the economy was changing, America was rapidly industrializing, and from that came a divide between a few who were very rich and the many who were desperately poor, and an ideology that sanctioned that, social Darwinism. While many scholars looking back at the late 20th and early 21st century have argued that today we're living in a new Gilded Age, marked by a great divide between rich and poor that has come with not just deindustrialization, the rise of a service sector economy, but deliberate government politics, policies like Reaganomics and the continuation of it in the Clinton era that have exacerbated that divide. So, a neo-Gilded Age in the sense that we continue to live in an age of haves and have-nots. And ideologies represented often in our pop culture that argue in a way that supports this, that argue that poor people deserve to be poor, that they are agents of their own demise, and that we should fixate on Kardashians and Real Housewives. So parallels are very keen and interesting. So by the end of the 20th century, conservatism triumphed, and it triumphed even in the presidency of Bill Clinton in this neo-Gilded Age. In the 1960s, the ratio of CEO pay, the ratio between what the average employee makes at a corporation and the chief executive officer, highest paid person, was about 1 to 26. Meaning the guy at the top makes 26 times the guy in middle management. And that makes sense. The CEO's got the most responsibility.
He's been there the longest. He's going to make a lot more than the guy in middle management. But by the end of the 20th century, that ratio had grown to 350 to 1, meaning the guy at the top makes 350 times what the guy in middle management makes. Haves and have-nots. We're hearing our modern America emerge. So by the end of the 20th century, you had this neo-Gilded Age, and a lot of it came from the sanctioning of conservative politics. Now, we end this lecture with a really important caveat. This conservative movement doesn't exist anymore. Trump blew it up. What's interesting to think about now is that everything I've talked about over the course of these slides, this conservative coalition that was very hawkish and interventionist on foreign policy, opposed to government spending, fiscal conservatives, and socially conservative, that coalition really has frayed because Trump, the nominee of the Republican Party in 2016, wasn't opposed to government spending, wasn't opposed to a lot of the interventionist role the government has played in the economy. He embraced that. And he was not an interventionist. He was not someone who supported the United States intervening around the globe. So this coalition has fallen apart. And the modern Republican Party is now the party of Trump and is trying to figure out where it goes in a post-Trump era, where it can't really go back and say, we believe in less government spending, and we believe in fiscal responsibility, and we believe in a strong, robust military defense. What has remained, though, as part of the Republican Party is the culture war element, the social cultural conservatism, which today isn't so much about gender and sexuality, though, of course, we've seen how conservatives are marshaling this anti-transgender effort as a way to sort of revive that element of the culture wars. Instead, the culture wars today tend to be much more about race and immigration. And so I don't know what's going to happen to this conservative coalition. I don't know what's going to happen to the Republican Party. I'm a historian. I'm much better talking about the past. But we're at kind of a punctuation mark in this story where the conservative movement I've detailed in this lecture has really come to an end. And I don't know where it goes in the future. But we shall see together. Stay tuned, and you'll be better to understand the history of conservatism and where it may go based on what you've learned in this lecture.